Welcome. Welcome to the second panel. And this panel will deal with the issue of ensuring U.S. competitiveness and international participation. Our first witness is Mr. Jack McMacken. He is a principal in the law firm of Williams and Jensen and a director of Owens, Illinois, a leading producer of glass containers. He is here today on behalf of the Energy Intensive Manufacturers Working Group on Greenhouse Gas Regulation. We welcome you, Mr. McMacken. Whenever you are ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Energy Intensive Manufacturers Working Group on Greenhouse Gas Regulation appreciates this opportunity to testify today. I am Jack McMacken, a principal in the law firm of Williams and Jensen, and I have served for 15 years as a director of Owens, Illinois. OI is headquartered in Perrysburg, Ohio, and it is the world's leading producer of glass containers. As the subcommittee is aware, our group was formed early last year for a limited but important purpose: to engage constructively with members of Congress, the environmental community, labor, and all interested stakeholders to attempt to solve the economic and environmental problem that is known as carbon leakage or job leakage. Our focus has been exclusively on the Inslee-Doyle type grant of free allowances or allowance value rebates. Since I appeared before the subcommittee last month, our working group has expanded. We include representatives of all of the traditionally recognized energy-intensive sectors, as well as companies from smaller sectors that our work has identified as subject to leakage. Our members include AK Steel, Alcoa, Corning, Cliffs Natural Resources, Dow, Wholesome U.S., NewPage Corporation, Nucor, Owens Corning, Owens Illinois, PPG, Rio Tinto, Terra Industries, U.S. Steel, and Weyerhaeuser. Much has changed and much progress has been made since last month. The upshot is that we are more convinced than ever that the leakage problem can be adequately addressed in climate legislation. Since our earlier testimony, Congressman Inslee and Doyle have introduced a new and strengthened version of their anti-leakage bill, and the discussion draft, in turn, has adopted much of the Inslee-Doyle mechanism. As a result, the discussion draft contains a structure that can work. That said, the draft also leaves critical decisions unmade and critical issues unfinished. The success of the anti-leakage provision hangs in the balance. Before turning to what we view as the two most important remaining issues, let me briefly mention one of the draft's key advances. The discussion draft, like the new Inslee-Doyle bill, has adopted a principled, data-driven mechanism for determining which sectors or subsectors should be eligible for anti-leakage allowances. Industries meeting specific energy intensity and trade intensity levels would be presumptively eligible, and others may make individual showings. This was a mechanism we advocated. We believe it is a major advance and that it brings a reasonable level of certainty as well as fairness to the process. Now for the two key remaining issues. The first is funding of the provision with an adequate number of allowances. The discussion draft, of course, is silent on this issue. My written testimony updates in some detail our submissions to the committee on this critical issue. In short, we believe the provision requires in the range of 850 to 900 million allowances. That represents about 16% of the allowances in the discussion draft's highest year, its fifth. The second issue is the phase down or termination of the anti-leakage allowance program. The solution to the problem cannot be phased out or terminated before the underlying problem of regulation-caused production cost disparity is solved, and the underlying problem will be solved only when other countries producing energy-intensive materials adopt climate change legislation that imposes on their industries costs comparable to what the ACES bill would impose on ours. We believe that the Inslee-Doyle bill is very close to creating a workable mechanism to govern phase down and termination of the provision, but that the ACES bill has yet to do so. Chairman Markey, I would like to mention one final other matter, an issue upon which you in particular have shown persistent leadership, and that's recycling. Use by energy-intensive industries of recycled materials in lieu of raw materials produces enormous savings in energy and even greater reductions in carbon emissions. Greater because not only combustion emissions, but also process emissions are greatly reduced. Those of us in the packaging industry, for instance, can make a bottle or a can out of recycled bottles or cans with a fraction of the carbon emissions. Yet we cannot get enough recycled materials. We urge you to include muscular effective provisions in the bill to enhance the opportunities for all energy-intensive industries to obtain and make use of recycled materials. In summary, Mr. Chairman, we commend you and all who have worked so hard to make possible the remarkable progress on the anti-leakage provisions, and we very much look forward to cooperating with you in any way that we can.
Can I have the next? Thank you, Mr. McMacken, very much. Our second witness is back again. We welcome you, sir. Rich Wells. He serves as Vice President of Energy for the Dow Chemical Company. He has also has a lead position in management of Dow Chemical's global advocacy activities in the areas of climate change and energy policy. He was appointed to the Michigan Climate Change Action Council in 2008. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin. Could you turn on your microphone, please?
I apologize. I appreciate the opportunity to provide our views on the competitiveness provisions of the American Clean Energy and Security Act. I am Vice President of Energy for Dow Chemical, a leading specialty chemicals and advanced materials company with over 50,000 employees, half of which are located in the U.S. Today I'd like to address Dow's position on climate change. As a member of U.S. Climate Action Partnership, or U.S. CAP, Dow supports enactment of environmentally effective, economically sustainable, and fair climate change legislation. As a representative from an energy-intensive and trade-exposed sector, I'd like to give you a glimpse into what the chemical industry is doing to save Americans energy and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Since 1990, the U.S. chemical industry has achieved energy efficiency gains of 28%. At Dow, that number is 38%. In Dow's case, we have saved over 1,600 trillion BTUs of energy since 1994, the electrical equivalent to power every home in California for 1 year. And our track record on greenhouse gas emissions reduction is equally impressive. At Dow, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by over 20%. This has resulted in preventing more than 86 million metric tons of CO2 from entering the atmosphere. The U.S. chemical industry as a whole can report similar numbers, numbers that would have exceeded Kyoto Protocol targets. The chemical industry also contributes a number of energy-saving products and materials to American society. This includes building and appliance insulation, as well as material that enables solar and wind power and other energy efficiency applications such as lighting. Simply put, the American chemical industry uses energy to save energy. In fact, a soon-to-be-released McKinsey study showed that the products of chemistry reduce an average 3 tons of greenhouse gas emissions for every 1 ton produced in our manufacturing process. As you can see, from an energy and greenhouse gas reduction viewpoint, this is an excellent story. However, from an economic standpoint, the situation is much different. Over the past 10 years, the U.S. chemical industry, a $660 billion enterprise, has lost over 120,000 jobs, or approximately 15% of our total workforce. For the most part, this loss of jobs can be attributed to high and volatile energy prices. As an example, Dow's energy and feedstock costs have gone from $8 billion in 2002 to over $27 billion in 2008. In order for a cap-and-trade system to be economically sustainable, it must be designed such that American energy-intensive and trade-exposed manufacturers remain globally competitive. We see the approach included in the discussion draft as a positive step towards protecting U.S. manufacturers. This approach defines these sectors based on objective criteria and includes provision to reduce or eliminate the allowances when the potential for carbon leakage has been reduced or eliminated. However, I would caution that it's critical that the number of allowances be adequate to compensate those sectors that meet the eligibility criteria. If Congress does not set aside enough allowances to address the carbon leakage issue, then it will fail to protect American jobs in the manufacturing sector. We also believe it is critical that the allowances not be reduced or eliminated until the competitive disadvantage is reduced or eliminated. Targeted assistance to energy-intensive industries should be terminated only when the carbon leakage problem is solved through an international agreement. In addition to the provisions that pertain to energy-intensive and trade-exposed sectors, other provisions in the bill also would impact the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturers. For example, the bill would provide compensatory allowances to companies that use fossil energy as a feedstock material rather than as a fuel source. Unfortunately, this provision is unworkable in its current form, and we recommend that it be modified to ensure that non-emissive uses of fossil energy are properly compensated. Dow also recommends changes to the bill to avoid excessive fuel switching from coal to natural gas in the power sector. These changes would include establishing a trigger price for the release of additional allowances and offsets from the strategic reserve to avoid the so-called dash to gas. In conclusion, Congress should pass energy and climate change legislation that maintains the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturers as we transition to a low-carbon economy. I thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wells, very much. Now, let us welcome Tom Conway, the International Vice President of the United Steel Workers. He has been in the steel business since 1978. Since working with the United Steelworkers, he has been involved in most of the major collective bargaining efforts within the United States steel industry. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. On behalf of the members of the Steelworkers, I'd like to thank Chairman Waxman and Markey and the committee for holding the hearing, and in particular recognize your leadership and the hard work you're doing crafting difficult climate policy that will ensure the competitiveness of U.S. workers and our industries. My name is Tom Conway. I'm the Vice President of Steelworkers Union. The USW has long been a leader in the labor movement on environmental issues, and we support the advancement of a climate policy. Our members work in nearly every sector of the economy. We produce a wide range of products, including paper, glass, cement, chemicals, aluminum, rubber, and, of course, steel. All these products are produced in facilities that are as efficient as any in the world, and we're ready to lead the way in the development and production of the next generation of clean energy products that will help revitalize the American economy and reassert our nation's leadership on the cutting edge of new technology. But we can only answer that call if our jobs are not squandered to the law of unintended but not necessarily unforeseen consequences. A well-designed climate policy can fuel America's recovery and ensure that the economy comes back stronger and cleaner than before, but a poorly designed policy can have the opposite effect and cost thousands or millions of Americans' jobs. In commodity-based industries such as ours, even small differences in production costs can have a huge effect. In crafting legislation, Congress must address the critical need to mitigate the competitive disadvantage that will be placed on these industries, as well as the carbon leakage that will occur as a result. Only by fully addressing the leakage issue can Congress meet their environmental and investment goals and ensure that the jobs that exist today in energy-intensive industries are not lost, nor the manufacturing these products offshored. Failure to fully address these issues not only endangers our recovery from the current recession, but will likely result in making the problem of climate change worse instead of better. For the purpose of time, I'm going to get straight to our suggested improvements to the competitiveness provision, but ask that members refer to my full testimony, which I've submitted for the record. One of the most delicate balancing acts in designing an economy-wide climate change policy is properly constructing transition assistance to specific industries that develop clean energy process and products. We're keenly aware of all the concerns, such as quantity, time length of assistance, and windfall profits associated with this assistance. And from that perspective, the Inslee-Doyle approach of tying allocations or rebates to output is the best and most effective allocation system that's been proposed to date, as eligibility is targeted very narrowly to those industries which demonstrate a high energy intensity profile and a potential for significant competitive disadvantage. However, while an allocation system such as output-based rebate system seeks to mitigate the cost differential between domestic and international products by reducing the effective cost of compliance for domestic producers, it is not designed to completely eliminate that differential. In the discussion draft, manufacturers in covered sectors or subsectors would be rebated 85% of the sector average carbon cost of producing each covered good. This rebate level would not only penalize the worst performers in a sector, but would impose an unrebated cost and a competitive disadvantage on a majority of companies in these sectors. As long as that differential exists at any level, a commensurate amount of leakage will be unavoidable. Therefore, the rebates must be coupled with a border adjustment to equalize carbon costs if the carbon leakage issue is to be fully addressed and Americans' environmental and economic goals achieved. On such a broader adjustment, once such a broader adjustment is enacted, the rebate level can and will act as an incentive to producers to reduce emissions. Until then, however, it will not eliminate the threat of leakage. In the interim, we must ensure that these cost pressures do not effectively destroy critical sectors of the economy until the full extent of the competitiveness program can be implemented. On the rebate levels, rebates to companies in covered sectors and subsectors should be increased to 100% of each firm's direct or indirect compliance costs from the date of enactment of the domestic program until the date of the enactment of an effective border adjustment. Once the border adjustments are in place, we would recommend that the rebates be paid at 100% of the sector's average per unit of output. This will ensure that producers who are better than average for their sectors will not be penalized despite their high performance, and will provide below average producers an incentive to reduce emissions to avoid paying an unrebated cost of compliance. As these below average companies improve their performance, this will drive the sector average emissions down, prompting companies to continue to reduce emissions. A border adjustment should be enacted as quickly as possible, although we're aware of the arguments that suggest some period of time is necessary before it can be done to allow for negotiation of an international treaty and to meet UN international obligations. As such, we're prepared to accept whatever length of time is necessary for this to be done right, as long as we eliminate leakage concerns during the interim through a full rebating of compliance costs. On the issue of presidential discretion, we have strong concerns with the discretion given to the President under the International Reserve Allowance Program in the discussion draft. Under that provision, in 2017, the President is directed to make a determination whether the rebates have been effective at preventing leakage, and no requirement that he make any subsequent determination. If the President does determine that leakage is occurring, then that leakage and the job loss that goes with it will be allowed to continue for an additional 2 to 3 years while regulations are written before a border adjustment is enacted to prevent it. If he decides no leakage exists on that day in 2017, there is no recourse should leakage develop later, either when the rebates begin to phase out or if foreign competitors simply wait until after that day to flood our markets with dirty products. Finally, the decision to implement a border mechanism should not be left to the discretion of the President or anyone else. The legislation should require that the border adjustment begin on a certain date and direct the President to issue regulations in sufficient time that it may begin on time. Addressing the potentially catastrophic issues posed by climate change is the challenge of our generation, and meeting that challenge will require the mobilization of everyone in the world behind a common purpose. It is time for America to reclaim its position of leadership in the world economy, and the United Steelworkers are ready to do everything in our power to assist that process. Again, I'm grateful to Chairman Waxman and Markey for holding this hearing, for the leadership provided by them, particularly Mr. Inslee and Mr. Doyle. We look forward to working with you in the committee now and in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Conway, very much. Our next witness, Trevor Hauser, is visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mr. Hauser's work focuses on analyzing energy markets and climate change. We welcome you, Mr. Hauser.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Hauser, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, and thank you for holding this important hearing. My name is Trevor Hauser. I'm a visiting fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. In conjunction with the World Resources Institute, we published a book last year called Leveling the Carbon Playing Field, and have been actively engaged in this issue of how to ensure that U.S. climate policy doesn't undermine U.S. competitiveness, and it's my honor to be here speaking on that topic before you today. I would just like to point out before I start that my comments are those of my own, not of the Peterson Institute. Climate policy will impact the competitiveness of the U.S. economy in several ways, and our ability to maximize the upside and minimize the downside breaks down to roughly 4 factors. The first, our ability to create a level playing field for carbon-intensive industries, the topic of this hearing today, but it's not limited to that, of course. It's our ability to capture opportunities in low-carbon technology, reduce dependence on imported foreign oil, and catalyze improvements in productivity more broadly. I'm going to focus my comments on the first, as that's the topic of this hearing, but it's important to keep in mind that the impact of climate policy on trade-exposed carbon-intensive industries is just one component of broader U.S. economic competitiveness. The bill before you today reduces emissions, U.S. emissions, along the lines necessary at a global level to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change, and I commend you for that effort. It also puts the U.S. in a leadership position for international negotiations. But as the outcome of those negotiations remains unclear, it's appropriate that we think about ways to prevent aggressive action here at home from undermining the competitiveness of our industry and risks that it would force industry to relocate, thus undermining the effectiveness of climate policy here at home. In our work looking at trade-exposed carbon-intensive industries that are vulnerable to leakage, we find that it's a limited group of industries accounting for about 0.5% of U.S. employment and 1.5% of U.S. GDP. Now, I don't say those numbers to say that leakage isn't a challenge. It's to say that it is a manageable challenge and one that we can deal with affordably through allowance revenue within the context of a broader bill. Using the criteria laid out in the Inslee-Doyle provision, we assessed how many industries at a 6-digit NAICS level would qualify, and it's a fairly affordable undertaking. About 11% of allowance value in the year 2014 would be required to hold the industries that qualify by the explicit criteria in the Inslee-Doyle provision harmless. Of those industries, a fair amount are agriculture and mining industries. And one of my comments to the committee would be to assess whether that was explicit intent to include agricultural industries and mining industries in the criteria, as our view is that they face different economics than manufacturing. That if you're mining or you're agriculture, the factor endowment, where you can actually grow the crops or mine the copper, is generally a more important consideration than carbon costs. So that's one issue I'd ask the committee to consider. We believe that this provision would be sufficient to address emissions leakage. If it is sufficient, then trade measures are not required. If it is not sufficient and trade measures are required, what's important is that to the extent that a price is put on imported goods, that's discounted by the amount of support that we provide for our domestic industries. It's critical that we don't double pay our industries through domestic support and adjustments at the border. That's important because it's a violation of our trade commitments, but also because it would set a bad precedent for other countries to do the same, to outwardly subsidize their industries under climate policy. The more important question, I think, is what this transitions to. Domestic supports are transitionary measures, and I think everybody on this panel would agree that the goal ultimately is to get to an international agreement that can effectively address emissions leakage. I think what's important in thinking about this legislation is how it can inform that process and how it can be specific about what types of international agreement would be necessary to phase out output-based rebating here in the U.S. I think that in the draft so far, there's been some vagueness there, and I think that bears clarification. Let me turn and make a couple comments about the international environment. We've moved a long way from where we were in 1997, and the outlook for a global agreement, I would say, is good. But that doesn't necessarily mean the same commitments by all different countries, right? Europe is going to reduce emissions more aggressively, likely, than here in the U.S., and countries in the developing world are going to reduce emissions less aggressively than we are. Now, from an environmental standpoint, that's okay, as long as we all get to the same 2050 endpoint. But that means different carbon prices for a transitionary period, which has impacts for trade-exposed carbon-intensive industries. Now, over the long term, we can deal with that through a harmonized carbon tax globally or through linking cap-and-trade systems. But as we get that infrastructure set up, we'd like to see coming out of international negotiations some specific commitments on key industries, among other major producers, to level the playing field. If we can get that type of agreement between major producers, then that'll more effectively address the issue of emissions leakage, and we'll make sure that we're reducing emissions of steel produced in China, not just in China for export to the U.S. I think that the bill before you today makes an important start in specifying costs at an industry level that would be necessary to reduce output-based rebating, I would ask that in going forward you provide guidance to the negotiators on what you'd like to see.
Thank you, Mr. Hauser, very much. And our next witness is Mr. Elliot Derringer. He is Vice President of International Strategies from the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. He has a long, very impressive history in this area. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear before you today. An essential complement to a strong domestic climate program is an effective international agreement ensuring that other major economies contribute their fair share to what must be a global effort. U.S. domestic legislation must therefore be designed to maximize prospects for such an agreement. The Pew Center believes that on the whole, the Waxman-Markey discussion draft provides a strong basis for effective international engagement. I'd like to highlight the draft's many strengths and suggest ways it could be further refined to help achieve a fair and effective global agreement. To facilitate strong U.S. participation in the global effort, domestic legislation must do several things. First, the legislation must set a solid foundation for a verifiable international commitment by the United States. By establishing ambitious mandatory targets through 2050, the discussion draft would indeed provide the basis in domestic law for a corresponding U.S. commitment under international law. The United States will have greater leverage in international negotiations, however, if it has the flexibility to take additional actions that can encourage stronger commitments by others. One way this can be done is by facilitating emission reductions outside the United States above and beyond those required for domestic compliance. The discussion draft would establish one such mechanism by using a portion of emission allowances to reduce deforestation in developing countries. We encourage the committee to consider allowing the use of allowance value to facilitate other types of mitigation action in developing countries as well. Second, domestic climate action must create positive incentives for emission reduction commitments by the major emerging economies, both through public finance and through market-based mechanisms. With respect to public finance, the Pew Center recommends a phased strategy, providing some immediate assistance to developing countries and greater support once countries commit to effective climate policies. The International Clean Technology Fund proposed in the discussion draft would constitute an important element of such a strategy. We believe the draft could be further strengthened in several ways. It should authorize immediate appropriations for two purposes. First, to support capacity-building activities in developing countries, and second, to fulfill the United States' pledge to fund the World Bank's new Clean Technology Fund. For the longer term, the legislation should designate a portion of allowance value for sustained support for technology deployment. As proposed in the discussion draft, this support should be conditioned on a recipient country's ratification of an international climate agreement. With respect to market-based approaches, the Pew Center strongly supports the use of international emissions offsets, both as an incentive for developing country action and as a mechanism to contain costs in a U.S. cap-and-trade system. We believe the offset provisions of the discussion draft would provide a strong incentive for developing countries to assume reasonable climate commitments. Importantly, the draft would recognize credits issued by an international body under a new climate agreement. This would enable the United States to influence the redesign and reform of the existing clean development mechanism or the design of a new international crediting mechanism. Third, domestic climate legislation must dedicate resources to help poor, vulnerable countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. The draft would establish a stronger framework for delivering direct bilateral assistance, and importantly, it would reserve 40 to 60% of the support available for U.S. contributions to an international adaptation fund. To help secure a strong climate agreement, the legislation must establish a clear, predictable, and sustained source of funding for these efforts. The Pew Center strongly supports designating an appropriate portion of allowance value for these purposes. Fourth, domestic climate legislation must facilitate the linkage of the United States emissions trading system in a global greenhouse gas market. We believe the discussion draft would lay the necessary foundation for linkage to other market-based systems. By recognizing allowances from programs establishing sectoral targets, it would provide another important incentive for stronger efforts by countries not yet prepared to take on economy-wide targets. Finally, domestic climate legislation must include transitional measures to address potential competitiveness risks to energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. The discussion draft takes a very sound approach to managing these risks. The use of output-based rebates as proposed would address the transitional competitiveness concerns likely to arise under a cap-and-trade system while maintaining the environmental integrity of the program and providing an ongoing incentive to producers to improve their performance. Critically, the draft contemplates the use of unilateral trade measures only as a last resort and only if the President determines that the rebate program has not been effective. This preserves trade measures as an option but defers their use to allow a reasonable period to assess the efficacy of the rebate program and to achieve effective international agreements. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the Pew Center believes that with modest improvements, the Waxman-Markey discussion draft would effectively position the United States to lead efforts toward an equitable and effective international agreement. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Derringer, very much. We have been notified that there are 7 roll calls on the floor of the House. We have 3.5 minutes for the members to go over to make these votes. So what we'll do is we'll take a 1-hour recess until 1:45, so that the members can make these votes, and our witnesses, if they would like, can grab a bite to eat. But we will re-adjourn, we will recommence at that point in time. And we apologize to all concerned. We have no control over the floor schedule. So we'll take a 1-hour recess.